Hello, everybody. Welcome to our session today. I'm going to be talking to you about getting more out of your Snowflake account. Glad to see everybody got a good attendance today, and apologize for the wait as we waited for people coming in. So, Snowflake, who am I? Why am I talking about Snowflake? I am one of the senior consultants at Altus. I've been working with Snowflake in various roles for the past 4 years, starting when they were purely a US-based company. Currently now they've rolled out to various cloud providers around the world, which is good to see. And so I'm going to share some of my experiences I've had over the years and ways you might be able to improve your current Snowflake usage and get more out of it. Altus as a company, so we've been operating for the last over 20 years at this point, and we have a range of offices throughout Australia, New Zealand, and the UK. So what kind of services do we provide? We provide all kinds of services in the data analytics pipeline, from your data governance and architecture work through to implementation, and then managed services and support for your existing product and services. We have a ethos as a company. We try to work with courage, heart, and insight. And so us as a company are going to work to get the best value for you as a customer, no matter what your requirements are. In terms of Snowflake, we have a range of experience. We have over 30 staff who have worked on at least one Snowflake project, and we have a range of staff, both accredited and certified in Snowflake, for whatever work you need. So today I'm just going to quickly go through what it means to get more out of Snowflake, which is our entire agenda here. So as a bit of a preface, this webinar is mostly focused on achieving more from your existing Snowflake account. We have some previous webinars on talking about setting up new frameworks. We have one from previous weeks on Snowflake streaming framework and how that can help you set up streaming into a new Snowflake instance. And we have an upcoming one in the next week or two around our data transformation framework, data scaffolding. So if you're interested in setting up a new Snowflake account, we can direct you to those, but this is specifically around getting more out of your existing Snowflake account. So I'm going to briefly run over some warehouse usage and optimization strategies and how you might look at your current workloads and get the most out of those. I'm going to give a bit of a deep dive into the Query Profiler, which is a inbuilt Snowflake tool to monitor how your workloads are executing on Snowflake, and go through an example of how you might use that to optimize an existing query. And then we'll have space for questions at the end. We do have a Q&A panel inside Zoom. So if you just check down the bottom, I believe there should be a Q&A button. And if you want to post any questions at any time, feel free to put them there in the chat. So what does it mean to get more out of Snowflake? Well, what we're going to want to look at is primarily your basic data requirements for any system you want to take data out of or put it into. You're going to want to look at your latency. How long does it take you to bring in the data and transform the data? How much does it cost in dollars? In Snowflake terms, those are called credits, and you'll have a specific dollar to credit ratio depending on your account. And we're also going to want to monitor our data sizes. So we're going to want to allow people to get more data into Snowflake, transform more data, ideally without having any impact on the other two requirements. So that's just here a brief overview. We want to be more efficient with our money and our time, and we want to bring in as much data as possible into Snowflake as your account begins to grow. So first thing I'm going to go over here is the warehouse optimization tips. As a brief introduction, if you're not familiar with Snowflake, a Snowflake warehouse is a compute unit that lives in the cloud. It is separate from the storage layer of the tables. And what this means is that for any one table, you may have multiple warehouses or compute units accessing the data at any one time. The compute unit for most customers is going to be your most expensive cost in terms of running Snowflake, but it is very flexible in that you can scale the size and the parallelism of the clusters, and you can turn them off and on at your will to save costs where appropriate. So it's a brief intro of things you do and don't want to do with your Snowflake warehouses. You're going to want to make sure your warehouses are the correct size in terms of compute capacity for your workloads, both large enough to cope with the workload, but not too large that you're spending excessive money where you could allocate somewhere else. You're going to want to make sure that your critical applications are separated so they don't contend for resources. So one benefit of the Snowflake warehouses is that if one warehouse is accessing a table and it's experiencing large load, you can actually spin up a separate warehouse completely independent to continue to access that same data without having to contend for resources with the other workload. You're also going to want to set up auto scaling on your warehouses. So this means any spikes in demand you might experience throughout the day are going to be automatically compensated for with additional resources when Snowflake detects it. One thing you don't want to do is have a large number of warehouses on for large periods of time because the compute resource is charged at a per minute or per second rate. You are going to be paying excessive costs if you have lots of compute on at the same time. But the benefit of Snowflake is that you can turn a lot of this compute off when you're not using it. And a last point in relation to the correct sizing is that you don't want your applications using a warehouse, but only making use of a small percentage of the compute resource that you've allocated. So first of all, I'm going to go through two common workloads here. First, I'm going to bring up fixed workloads. So this is your typical piece of work that you might schedule on a hourly, daily, monthly basis that will, say at the end of the day, start a piece of work, execute that fixed piece of work, and then stop. So typically this will be an aggregation of any data you've found within the day or the hour, but it's not going to be a piece of work that's running all of the time. It's a fixed batch, and you want to start and stop it on a schedule. So what you're mostly going to want to do is explore your cost and latency analysis on these workloads. Typically Snowflake, you get good scaling out of increasing your warehouse size, but you're going to want to perform a bit of analysis on what your correct size is. So here I have a quick run through of how to run some experiments on your account. You want to set the result caching Snowflake feature to false while you run your experiments. So this is a Snowflake feature that if you run the same query multiple times, it will start to cache the result and return that back to you in a lot quicker fashion. If you're going to want to try and record the performance of queries, you don't want that caching to occur, and you want it to re-execute the query every time. So this is just a strategy for repeating your queries on different sizes of warehouses. And obviously, the more you run your queries, the more accurate your results are going to be. One thing I will note quickly is that on a warehouse, if you run queries on the same data multiple times, it will begin to store that data in the warehouse's local memory. So you may see after the first 1 or 2 runs that your queries run a bit faster, but for the most case, this should be okay in terms of comparing between warehouses. It's not going to have a large effect. So what does this look like when you've run it? Here I have an example query over 150 million rows and 5 tables. It's not the world's smallest query. It's not the world's largest query. Somewhere in between. Pretty standard workload, I would think, for someone with a Snowflake account that has existed for a moderate period of time. And what we're analyzing here is that with the warehouse size, how does the performance of the query scale? And what you can actually see quite often is that even though the extra small is very slow, here it's taking 2 minutes to execute this query, it's taking about 0.03 credits cost. So this is your cost to keep the warehouse up, multiplied by the amount of time that the warehouse is online running this query. But because of Snowflake's architecture, you're getting additional parallelism as you scale the size of these compute units. So Snowflake's compute scales in t-shirt sizes from extra small through to, I believe it goes up to 4XL here. But you can see quite quickly that even though from an extra small to a medium or a large, you're getting drastic performance improvements from 2 minutes to 45 seconds, 31 seconds. You're actually not spending all that much more money on your total credit cost, purely because these warehouses don't have to be online as long to run the query. So this is going to change depending on your own business requirements. If it is very critical that you get this data as soon as possible, it may be worth it for you to spend 0.3 of a credit to save 100 seconds and get that data really, really early. A lot of the sweet spot is probably landing in this medium large area where you're not spending a whole lot more money to run this fixed workload, but you're getting under half the total latency and the time to run this workload. Cool, so that's fixed workloads. Now I'm going to have a bit of a deep dive into continuous workloads. So typically this will be some task that either repeats itself or a stream event-driven architecture where you're constantly processing data coming into Snowflake. Typically this might be some website-based clickstream data or some IoT data that comes in at high frequency. And what you're going to want to do here is not necessarily explore your uptime versus latency, and as we did in the fixed workload, but you're going to want to optimize that continuous workload so that it's always making the most use as possible of the compute resources you spin up. Yeah, so what I'm going to do is have a bit of a dive into how that looks. I'm going to have a look at some of the Snowflake automatically generated graphs on warehouse usage. You can find that, as you can see here, in your Snowflake account under the Warehouses tab. And if you drill into individual warehouses, it will give these handy graphs. A bit of an overview of what you're seeing here. Each of these bars corresponds to a 5-minute period. And semi-confusingly, it will displays the average number of queries running during that 5-minute period. So if you were to look at this warehouse at any time during this 5-minute period, it's most likely that you would see 5 queries running. Your blue bar corresponds to the currently executing queries, and your yellow corresponds to queued queries or queries waiting for resources. So reading this graph, you're seeing here around 50% chance at any one time that there may be a queued query on the warehouse, and you're probably running around 3 to 5 queries at any one time. So why is this good? Well, the small amount of querying probably tells you that you are making maximum usage of the compute resource available. This may not be always appropriate in terms of you may never want to queue, so it might be ideal that you add a bit of additional compute to this warehouse, but in terms of your medium latency workloads, where it has little consequence, if you have a 30-second, 1-minute delay in your total query execution, this is a very good balance in terms of spend to compute allocated. Another good pattern you might observe or you might undertake is having event-driven infrequent workloads. So you can see this particular warehouse has maybe 2 or 3 queries run on it over the course of every hour. So this is going to be very cheap in terms of most of the time this warehouse is off, and it will spin up a small amount of resource every 20 minutes or so when an event comes in, and then turn itself off for the rest of the time. This may cost you a credit or 2 across the course of the entire day. One thing you have to be aware of here is that your infrequent workloads have the tendency to become frequent workloads if they increase. But in terms of data, you expect to always come in on an infrequent basis. This can be a very good idea in terms of triggering data through into the system. It's also very low latency, so if you're wanting to make sure your data is always processed as soon as possible, this is a great way to go about it. But as I mentioned a second ago, because your infrequent workloads have the tendency to grow over time, you may encounter a growth into something along these lines. And this is where your account can become quite expensive. Here you can see this warehouse is up a lot of the time. It is always running something or has run something recently, but it's not actually doing a whole lot. You can see within these 5-minute periods, it may run 1 or 2 queries within the 5-minute period, and then it's going to remain online until it your warehouse, you're typically going to configure a amount of time until it shuts itself off. Typically, this warehouse is going to run a query, wait a small amount of time, and then encounter another query. So this means it's always going to be online and always charging you that compute usage credits. On top of that, it's also not making very good use of the compute resource. It has all this compute resource available, and it's mostly sitting idle and doing small amounts of work. So what might you want to do to combat this? It's possible to combine workloads on warehouses. So here you may want to combine 2 or 3 of these workloads, stack them on top of each other, and make more use of the parallelism available in Snowflake. This is going to mean you're not paying for 3 warehouses on at the same time. You only have to pay for 1. And this is best when your latency requirements are reasonably flexible. If a delay of 1 minute is business critical, then you're probably not going to want to combine your workload. But if you have a large number of medium latency workloads that are operating on their you're not going to want to combine your workloads for low latency data. And if your workload has a high likelihood of spiking uh, in terms of usage, you don't want to overwhelm your other tasks on the same warehouse. You may also want to deliberately keep these workloads separate. For example, your finance and HR divisions might have budgetary requirements, and once you start combining these, it gets a bit murky around who pays for what. Cool. Great, so here's a quick summary of what you might want to do with your warehouses. We're wanting to perform these sizing experiments for your fixed workload tasks, as I mentioned at the start, and drilling into your continuous working warehouses. We're going to make sure that you're always making the optimal usage of your compute size. And as always, we encourage you to revisit this periodically, whether that be monthly, bi-monthly, I wouldn't say yearly, as workloads in the clouds tend to escalate quite quickly if you don't keep an eye on them. But you're definitely going to want to revisit this frequently and decide if you're still making the optimal usage of your Snowflake account. Great, so now that we have gone over warehouses, I'm going to have a bit of a drill into the query profiler, which is Snowflake's built-in tool around analyzing the workloads of the tasks, the queries that you execute on your warehouse, and drilling into where the bottlenecks may occur, what's holding up your data, and what you can do to improve your workloads to bring this all through faster. Quick overview on how to find the query profiler. You're going to want to go into your query history, select the query ID of the workload you want to inspect, and then there is a profile tab inside this query history that is going to bring you through to the profiler. First thing you're going to see is a complex tree that has a range of nodes and leaves. A brief overview over what this is showing. At the bottom, you have your table scans. So each of these leaves on the tree here corresponds to a table that we're reading from. And the final result at the top, whether that be a write to a table or returning the result to a user, that occurs at the top of the tree. Your in-between steps, where your branches combine, correspond to table joins. So this will be any combination of data you're doing to filter or grab attributes from other parts of the system. And your intermediate nodes, so these vertical ones, each correspond to a compute data transformation operation, whether that be filtering or window functions or aggregates or the like. One note, if you see G, so you might see 1.3K rows, kilo rows, 1,000, M for million, and G, I assume is for giga rows or billion rows. So if you see 10G, that corresponds to 10 billion rows coming through this pipeline. So I'll just go through briefly a quick example of how this might be helpful and how you can use it to analyze a query. This is the screen you'll see once you step into the profile tab. It's a bit complex at first, but there's a few things we want to look at immediately. I will note here that this is a 12-minute query. It's very slow, and it's been made deliberately slow for the purposes of examples. What you can see immediately is that your bytes are spilling to local storage. So what this means is that the Snowflake warehouses are allocated a certain amount of CPU and RAM and SSD disk. Ideally, all of the table data that you're trying to process is going to fit inside that local memory and not start spilling out to the disk, which we're seeing here. So in this particular query, we have 71 gigabytes of data spilling out of memory into disk. So this is meaning your warehouse is going to have to read and write that data multiple times to finish execution, and it's going to slow down quite a bit your processing. One other thing to note in the query profiler is there is a handy view to see the most expensive nodes. So it's not always obvious what's going on here in this very large tree, and you might want an opportunity to quickly evaluate how where your pain points are. Here we can see that this particular window function has taken 44% of the overall execution time. So that's probably a very good place to start in our evaluation. Drilling into this expensive node, we can see that we're performing a window function over 1.3 billion rows. So this is likely where the warehouse is starting to spill data to disk during this computation. And it's also telling us that because this is taking a very significant amount of our time, a window function is quite a compute heavy operation. So we're probably quite constrained on compute as well while performing this query. So what do we want to do with this information? Well, because this is both memory and compute constrained, most basic option is probably to increase the size of the warehouse. Snowflake is very good at optimizing these type of workloads. When you have a constraint for compute and memory, increasing your warehouse size is probably going to come at a very low cost and give you great results. Of course, we have a few more complex options. We can look at the query itself and start filtering data before we arrive at this window function. Maybe in this join, we want to exclude a certain amount of rows, or maybe we want to aggregate the data first to a less fine grain before performing our window function over it. As you go up the amount of work tree, you may want to think about performing this window function before you read the data. Maybe you do it on write if you're reading this quite often and you're performing this very often. And this will involve altering your upstream workflows that are bringing this data into Snowflake or into the table that we're querying here. And obviously you have your most complex option, which is to refactor the entire workflow and maybe go back to the drawing board and experiment with different ways of computing the result that this window function gives you, or maybe you want to separate this query into multiple batches that don't involve running this over 1.3 billion rows at the same time. So for this particular workflow, because we seem to be compute and storage constrained, I'm going to explore first the option of increasing our warehouse size. So as we did before, having a quick look at our execution time and costs analysis, we can see that increasing our warehouse size here actually has very little cost increase, going from a extra small to even a 2 extra large. You're looking at maybe 30% cost increase, while decreasing your total runtime from that terrible 12-minute runtime extra on the extra small to a much more manageable 30 seconds on the 2XL warehouse. So this is one of the great things about Snowflake, is that we can continue to crank these compute resources up. Once we go past the 2XL for this particular workload, you're starting to get decreasing benefits. But if your business case suits it, then it may be suitable for you to pay twice as much to land this data in 13 seconds versus 30. Cool. So one other thing we can do with the query profiler is we can use it to recognize when clustering on Snowflake isn't performing optimally. And what clustering is in Snowflake is the structure in which your data is written to the tables. So groups of rows are joined together in a partition, and these partitions have metadata attached around cluster keys you define. And if you are smart around how you operate this table, there is a auto clustering feature available as well. Your data is going to start to be clustered, organized appropriately according to your clustering keys. So what this is going to allow you to do is read from that table faster. It means when Snowflake wants to get data related to a particular key, maybe that's someone's name, it's going to have to look at less portion of the total table to bring that data through. So an example of how this might look when you've got a poorly clustered table, you can see here we've got a table that I believe has a few 100 million rows, and we are querying a total of 450,000 out of it, looking for the key ABC123. And you can see that in order to get this query, these rows, Snowflake has had to look at 2,700 out of the total 3,600 partitions in the table. So this means it's had to look at a whole 26 gigabytes of data to bring through these 400,000 rows. And in a comparison with a good clustering key, in this case, the insert time is typically a very well clustered key, simply because typically your data comes in a sequential order or roughly sequential. So your partitions are well structured in terms of rows being allocated to a certain time window. And you can see in comparison to the previous query, we've got 2.5 million rows here, but the Snowflake has actually only had to look at 60 of our 3,600 partitions, and it's only had to scan 46 megabytes of data. So this is going to significantly speed up your query runtime, and it's going to make sure you can get to those higher layers of the tree faster and get your data through in a more efficient fashion. Perfect. So a bit of time for questions here. Let me know if you have anything. Feel free to pop it into the Q&A box in Zoom. While we're waiting, I will go quickly over a summary. So two really important things about your Snowflake really is you're going to want to be monitoring your usage as you go. Typically, these software will always degrade over time. So you're going to start getting increased data loads. You're going to start having more people use Snowflake as they realize the power of it. And so you're going to want to monitor and reevaluate how your account is going, typically over time. In terms of the high cost workloads, so this is something you want to look at during these periodic revisits. And you're going to want to look at your most expensive queries and workloads. You can do this using the views that Snowflake provides around account usage. And you're going to want to explore using tools such as the query profiler, how that workload is executing and ways you can more efficiently bring that data through. I don't have any questions come through in the chat at the moment, so I will move on to a promotion we have. So anyone who's attended this workshop, you are welcome to a 2-hour discussion on continuing your Snowflake journey. Any pain points you have on your current Snowflake account, we're happy to run through, give you some tips and some suggestions around how to improve that. So feel free to get in touch with regards to that. Not seeing any questions, but thank you for participating, and I will now end our webinar. Thank you for coming.